Okay, in this video I'm going to look at creating color contrasts using the complementary color harmony. And in the last video I made this palette here, so I'm just going to go ahead and expand these blends and then ungroup them so that I can move the swatches around a little bit. Now let's just take a look at the color contrast that we need to create for this particular assignment. Across. Okay, so the assignment's asking for a contrast of hue, contrast of value, and a contrast of saturation. So we'll first look at how to create a contrast of hue. Now the highest contrast of hue you can create is with a complementary pair at full saturation. So here we have a highest contrast of hue. Of course, you won't find a low contrast of hue in this case because we're only working with complementary hues. So in each of these cases we're going to get, or we're always going to get a high contrast of hue. We'll look at a lower contrast of hue when we're dealing with the split complementary harmony. Looking at value though, we can create both a high contrast of value and a low contrast of value using this palette. So to create a high contrast of value, we're going to need a high key color and a low key color. Now I think for the sake of these assignments we might avoid using white and black altogether, so I'm just going to delete those from my palette. And instead, the darkest hue I have in this green range is this dark green here, and the lightest one is this one here. So we can have a high contrast of value with these two hues, or with the equivalent in the pink range. But of course you can also have a high contrast of value and a high contrast of hue by switching these two around. And in terms of low contrast of value, we'll be looking at hues that are pretty much the same. So that could be, for example, these two hues have a very low contrast of hue, a low contrast of value but a high contrast of hue. The same goes with this pair here. And looking at contrast of saturation, that's of course looking at the colours in our palette that have grey in them. A high contrast of saturation will be a hue like this, our pure hue that has no grey, and grey itself. So there we have a really high contrast of saturation. A low contrast of saturation would be perhaps, actually I can leave that one there, two desaturated hues from the same part of the scale. So there's a low contrast of saturation there. And don't forget you can also mix up the hues. So these three hues have a low contrast of saturation, but of course they have a high contrast of hue. Now, what else can we say about contrast of saturation? I think that's about it. So that's how you create various contrast relationships using the palette that you have. And it's about using these hues together in your design. So let's take a look at this design here in terms of high and low contrast. So of course there's high hue contrast throughout this main star shape of the design, where we have a lot of blues and oranges right up against each other. Whereas the background here has a low contrast of hue because it's all one hue. Now in terms of value, there's a high contrast of value up here where the light orange is against the darker orange, but there's no contrast of value. Actually, there's no area where there is no contrast of value. There's contrast of value throughout this entire design. Low contrast of value would be down here, actually, in the background. And there's not a great deal of saturation in this design. I haven't used many grey tones at all, unfortunately, but perhaps we'll look at that when we're looking at the split complementary design. We also want to consider principles of simultaneous contrast, complementary contrast, and value contrast. We've already looked at value contrast, and you know that complementary contrast is going to happen anyway because you're only using complementary hues. Simultaneous contrast is something that you can read about in the online lecture, but you'll find that it happens mostly when you have your hues layered up right next to each other. If you have your fully saturated complementary pair laid up right next to each other, the pink will make the green look greener and the green will make the pink look pinker. So this idea of simultaneous contrast keeps the colours as vivid as they can possibly be. So it's a great idea to use simultaneous contrast for the point of emphasis in your design. And you can see that I've used that here, where the complementary contrast is used in this design with the orange and blue close together right there to create emphasis and to draw the viewer's eye towards that part of the design. Okay, I think that that's the second part of this video over, and I will do a third part that looks at emphasis, scale and gravity.